Well, I appreciate, again, everybody's patience as we're trying to figure out some of these technical pieces of things. If you are used to some of my other presentations, you know that I tend to be much more dialogical, but again, due to the medium that we're working with and just the nature of this particular talk, I have set it up to be a little more formal with times of conversation and dialogue in between, and especially at the end. I appreciate you sticking with me as we work through this. And if it sounds like I'm reading from a script, it's probably because I am. So I will try not to do all that good stuff. We're going to start with the story of Chris. Now, Chris, so just to make it clear as well, the names and the scenarios of the story have been changed to, protect privacy issues, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a true person, but hidden enough so that we can talk about him and the way it applies to what I'm talking about today. So Chris was 43 years old. He's in extreme pain, bedbound, and he was impoverished. Barely a penny to his name. Chris's primary physician had originally brought in the palliative care team. That's the team that generally deals with long-term chronic pain, as well as help people transition to hospice. And that's why they were brought into Chris, to help Chris transition to hospice care. However, Chris had declined hospice care. And so as a result, the team treated Chris for over 4 years for a chronic debilitating disease that would eventually kill him. The medical team did not want to do this. They felt like it was cruel, but Chris was clear time and time and again. He would say, no hospice, no hospice, no hospice. Every few months, a member of the palliative care team would take a crack and see if they could convince him to change his mind. And again, every few months, it was no hospice, no hospice, no hospice. And as Chris's disease progressed, so did the moral injury for the palliative care team. And if only they knew why, they thought they might know how to approach him, but he would just simply say that I don't want hospice. When I became involved, the palliative team had just approached him to pitch hospice one more time. And again, Chris had said, no hospice. The team had discussed his case, and the physician and social worker both felt like Chris was having some sort of existential crisis, but they couldn't get him to talk about what it was. Normally, they would have sent in the chaplain. That's kind of a part of what we do. But Chris was an avowed atheist and had made it just as clear that as much as he did not want to talk about hospice, he didn't want to talk to a chaplain. So during the consultation, though, with the team, I offered my services as a humanist and therefore atheist chaplain. And I told him I'd be glad to talk to him from that perspective if he'd allowed me. Immediately after that meeting, the physician and I went to Chris's room for an introduction, and he was understandably hesitant. After all, there are very few humanist chaplains in the country. We have under 100 of us, so who has even heard of one of us? But eventually I convinced him of my bona fides, and he invited me to sit down, and we talked. And over the next 3 days, we spent an hour each day together. And here's kind of what I found out from talking to Chris. His Christian family had rejected him when he deconverted. He was also a very introverted, reserved man, and so he had very few friends. And most of his friends were in a similar social economic realm of him. That is, that they didn't have a lot of money. They were living paycheck to paycheck, working in the same field that Chris was originally working in. The disease had forced Chris to stop working, and so he had run out of money long ago. He was living basically month to month on Social Security and disability. And while Chris did admit that he was in a lot of pain and humiliation from the disease, even saying that if he could do it all over again, he said he would have made the opposite decision 4 years ago. I pointed out that he could make a different decision now and expressed curiosity about what kept him from saying yes to hospice now, 4 years later. So it turned out that, as is not uncommon for secular patients, that Chris's main concern focused on legacy. with an estranged family and no children. He wanted to make extra sure that the legacy he left behind was a good one. And particularly, he didn't want to burden his friends, the few friends he had, with the cost of his medical bills or the cremation and dispersion of his ashes. And fortunately, this was an easy fix. With his permission, I retrieved some paperwork, called some folks. His community arrived, and decisions were made. Chris chose a funeral home, filled out all the paperwork that would allow the state to absorb the cost of his cremation, and planned his funeral with his friends. So by the time that he was finally saying yes to hospice a week later, everything had been arranged. He no longer had to worry about being a financial burden to his friends, being a time burden about worrying how they would receive him or remember him. And he even decided the way he wanted to die. And he died actually in our hospital, surrounded by his friends, several of the nurses, the palliative team that had come to know him over the last 4 years. And they were playing the Beatles song "In My Life." And Chris died peacefully. So in my mind, Chris is somebody who I would describe as a spiritually secular patient. He did not believe in any deity, no supernatural belief in his life, but he still had some deep, what some might call spiritual pain. For whatever reason, the social workers over the previous 4 years were unable to help Chris explore this pain, and to be honest, most chaplains may have missed it. But it doesn't have to be that way. Chaplains can adopt a broader understanding of spirituality and spiritual distress, and I spend a lot of time working with chaplains on that side of things. But on the other side, I would argue that humanism could provide a language and structural philosophy of life to help people like Chris navigate difficult decisions. And humanist communities like ours could more actively provide people like Chris and others a place to land, a community of welcoming, similar-minded individuals who could welcome people, especially those who find themselves somewhere on what I've come to call the secular spectrum. Anywhere from the devout atheist, agnostic, even deists can be effectively, as they act on a day-to-day basis, or their morality or ethics can function very similar to what atheists or agnostics function as. So my intent today is to outline some of these ideas to move humanism forward. Chris's story will be our guide. I'll repeat some of the story that you heard and integrate it into what I've been talking about. And we're going to review some of the pertinent research on religion and spirituality and some health outcomes. There are some problems with the research, but it does tell a convincing story. There's enough of it that it's hard to just discount it entirely. And so by the end of this talk, when we view the research on religion and spirituality in America, along with this impact of religion and spirituality on health outcomes, I'm hoping that we can be convinced enough of the depth of the problem and maybe begin to see new ways of how an engaged humanism can help address it. And I will conclude the presentation with some proposals. It's not really new language, but really a new understanding of language and openness for secular humanism. And that's kind of the hint of the title, right? Spiritually secular. We don't need to toss out the language of either one in order to find an integrated whole that is something to offer the public. So the current state of research. Let's take a look at that. So it is important that, for me, the foundation of this talk be evidence-based and focused on research. And the two main areas of research that are informing me today focus on the effect of religion and spirituality and health outcomes, and that's kind of what this section will be focused on. And also the general state of American spirituality, which again will be the next section. So it is important for me to kind of get a disclaimer here. Some of this research is not perfect. and yet it will be kind of challenging, and we will offer some critiques at the end of the section. And if you have a question, this is the end of the section. We're going to break. We'll have some questions, some dialogue, and hopefully flesh out some of these ideas. So, including overall health, research into religion and spirituality has actually been going on for decades. Over that time, there have been thousands of articles largely showing a positive relationship between religiosity, really, and health outcomes. The researchers are not just chaplains or other religious professionals. In fact, they're mostly not. Their research comes primarily from physicians, nurses, and social workers who have come to realize or become curious about this intersection between spirituality and health. There, again, are a lot of flaws and biases in this research. However, over the past 20 years or so, the research has become increasingly reliable and more complex. And, we've moved away from saying that one's religious beliefs, what one believes affects religious outcomes, which is kind of where the original research started out, to recognizing that it is sort of the religious practices that really kind of have a hold on the positive or negative effects of one's health. So things like regularly going to church, praying, etc., they appear to have connected to a general positive health outcome for a lot of things, ranging from heart disease to cancer and HIV, not only physical, but mental. There have been studies that show that secular patients tend to have a higher rates of depression and overall negative psychological well-being. And so much so is this evidence that one recent article concluded, this is a quote here, that our review of medical literature found that religiosity is multidimensional in nature and has a profound protective effect through the course of a disease. Not only does it hinder the onset of various diseases, but it also may slow down progression of untreatable diseases and enhance remission of treatable diseases. Another article goes on to, so far as to conclude that there is, quote, a small, robust health liability, end quote, to secularism. So then we get to the question, why is there this liability? Is there something inherently unhealthy about secularism? If so, is it worth the risk? So clearly, as a humanist, I'm slightly biased, but we can explore this question in a little bit more detail. People who identify as somewhere on the secular spectrum tend to be like me, honestly, white, cisgendered, male, middle class or above. So we are overall a relatively privileged bunch. This is obviously not taken into account other places where this privilege might be mitigated. For example, one's LGBTQIA plus identity, one's able-bodiedness, but this is a place to start. But even with this point of privilege, studies show that atheism comes with a serious social cost. The Pew Research Forum puts out every year or so the way that people feel about different faith traditions, and until 2014, atheists were the least favored religious tradition, faith tradition, however you want to call it, in the country, just below Muslims. At 2014, we flipped. So we went actually from Muslims being 41% people felt positive about it to 40% atheists, or 40% of people felt positive about atheism. The numbers flipped. So that starting from 2014 onward, 41% of people felt positive about atheism and 40% felt positive about Islam. So even that, that's not a very warm feeling towards atheism and skepticism. Because of this negative feeling, it can be considered as having its own closeted identity with its own, psychological problems of the closeted identity. That can be a cause for the high rates of depression and anxiety, and with its own type of microaggressions. And again, microaggressions can lead to depression, and depression can lead to poor health outcomes. So it is possible that poor health outcomes, I would argue that it actually is, that many of the poor health outcomes are not inherent to secularism, but a result of living in a context where atheism is seen as less than. If this is the case, then change needs to happen at the social level rather than the individual level. It's not incumbent upon the patient to change their ideas, but it is incumbent about the society to change their approach. And part of that question is who gets to decide what counts as a good outcome. One research group explored the different values undergirding theists and secular people, and they point out that for many theists, their understanding of right and wrong is absolute, handed down to humanity from the divine or God or gods, or however that might be understood in one form or another from the supernatural. In other words, there's an absolute morality. There's a clear distinction of what is right and wrong, while we secular people tend to be towards more moral subjectivity. What is right and wrong is largely contextual to place and time, and that sort of thing. The human need combined with how we understand the world at the time is a large impact on how we understand what is moral or ethical. So, what does this have to do with good health outcomes? Well, theistic people tend to see value in suffering or find comfort in the idea that God has a plan for the suffering for their lives. There's an inherent meaning behind the suffering that they are going through, or there is hope in a miracle for what their current illness is. And while this is, could be seen as rejection of reality, it does tend to honestly, in the long run, seems to have a positive overall emotional impact on the theistic people. They tend to have an absolute value on life, whatever its quality. Their focus tends to be on quantity. Secular people see each person as able to determine for themselves when the suffering of their illness is ultimately meaningless, in the sense of they have lost their understanding of what it means to be human. They see no value in the suffering, the continuing on of their pain. And so because of this, secular patients actually, because of this, secular patients tend to focus on the quality rather than the quantity of life. So if you have a medical system that sees the quantity of life as the quote unquote good outcome, when secular patients moved to less aggressive treatments towards the end of life, move quicker to hospice outcomes, etc., that's going to skew the results of what is considered a good outcome. It might be a good outcome based on a system of thinking wherein the quantity of life is more important than the quality of life. But it is not a good outcome if the quantity of life is suffering and meaningless suffering and provides no overall benefit to the individual or to society. And there's actually been studies that have shown that people who tend to have what is usually seen as a traditional understanding of the afterlife, good quote unquote religious coping skills, they actually take treatments that are more aggressive. Instead, secular patients tend to move to hospice, deny the aggressive treatment. And so, we tend to show as less good outcomes because the system itself is biased against what I would consider and what other secular patients would consider to be really the good outcome. And I talked about religious coping measurements, and that's kind of another inherent bias in some of this research. So responses to suffering that could lead one to a more secular outlook of life are deemed quote unquote negative. So if you come, if you're in through your suffering, you come to question the existence of God, this is considered a negative health outcome. Responses that draw ones closer to a theistic mindset are labeled positive. Now, despite this bias, there is so much overwhelming evidence that people who tend towards positive religious coping tend to have better overall health than those with negative religious coping. What secular patients who don't fall into these two categories, and here there seems to be a mixed bag. That is, they are not clearly let me go this way. Some studies showed negligible differences between secular patients who are more solid in their secularism or in their atheism or their humanism, and then than those who are more unsure of what they believe. And in some ways, there are a few studies that show secular people are healthier than theistic patients in some ways. And this is usually some of the physical aspects. We tend to have healthier weight levels. We tend to exercise more, but I tend to be unhealthier in other ways, and those are again usually the psychological side of things. So I kind of hinted at it, but there's a study that suggests whether theistic or secular, the more confident you are in your belief, the better your overall health and coping skills. So that the biggest people at risk are those who are nominally religious or those who might consider themselves spiritual but not religious. The second suggests, there's another study that suggests that the nominally religious become more devoted followers of their tradition when facing a crisis. So if you are not particularly a practicing Christian, maybe you're a holiday sort of level of Christian, if that, when you come into the hospital or you're facing an emotional or physical crisis, that person will tend to rely on whatever religious upbringing they had. So they would become more Christian. They might go to church more, etc. And Chris is a secular patient. He had moved out of that entirely. His family had cut him off entirely because of this. And so the traditional spiritual assessment tools determined that Chris did not have any spiritual distress because he did not have any real spirituality. And so he didn't need to see a chaplain, and Chris would have understandably agreed with this. And when initially offered a chaplain, Chris said no, and rightfully so, the care team honored his wishes. However, because he was secular, the team did not even consult a chaplain at all. And as he continued to refuse hospice, the team assumed that because he was secular, he must be afraid of dying, which is not true at all. They were not aware of the research that shows that secular patients tend to switch to hospice earlier than theists that are more traditional. And to be fair, I doubt most chaplains know this. But this meant that Chris's decision is unusual, and so should garner some curiosity. What did he feel like he was getting out of extending his life in his suffering? No one asked him this question, and while the team clearly saw Chris's need for processing the impact of his illness had on his existential life, they did not know how to address it. And this is where the skill of a chaplain really can come in handy. We are trained to explore these existential things. When we come to this incongruity between what we should be expecting from the patient and what they are doing, we want to explore that with them and see why, and start to help them figure out a new way forward for them through their the mode of which they find meaning making. So at this point, I'm going to pause here, see if we have any questions before we move forward.
Ben, we had one question from Jeff Dubin. Doesn't the question, is it worth the risk, imply that disbelief is a choice?
Yes, I would agree that it is. And I've worked with many people who have made the decision that for whatever reason in the moment it was not quote unquote worth the risk. I'm thinking of a patient who had been similar to Chris, been rejected by her family. She was a lesbian and atheist, and she was facing, for a variety of reasons, she was facing the end of her life at a young age from cancer, essentially without community. And she decided that the value of her relationship to her family as she died was more important to her than the authenticity of her atheism. And so she decided that to rebuild that relationship with her family, she would kind of quote unquote fake repent. In a sense, she decided to go back into the secular closet so that she could die in a way that was meaningful to her, surrounded by her family, the little community that she could build for herself at that time. I would just think of that as someone who just looked at the risks of being secular, of not having community, and decided that's not a risk I'm willing to take. I'm willing to instead take the pain and suffering of maybe being in the closet in order to live into other values that I find more important.
All right. We've got one from Charlene. Would there also be a factor that religious people are also more pro-life leaning, thus wanting to preserve their own lives longer?
Yeah, I think the underlying value is connected to both, that there is a certain sacredness to life and a certain idea that, especially for the more traditional, that life is instilled by God. And so by being more quote unquote pro-life or pro-birth, they are valuing the life that God has given through the birthing process. And then on the other end of things, they are valuing the life that God has given by doing everything they think as they feel is reasonable, as, you know, holding out hope for giving God the opportunity to extend their lives. To do otherwise for them kind of goes against that same value. It's just kind of manifesting itself on both ends of the spectrum of the human experience. Okay.
Any other questions? Oh, one more. So this is from Jason. I hear the word existential. What do you mean by this word?
Yeah, it's a good question, Jason. Existential in this realm of things, I would take to be kind of what it means at its very core of what does it mean to exist as a human being? What is it? What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to live a human life? That sort of thing. That can be manifested in a variety of different ways. Existentialism kind of being a clear one. But when I'm talking about this sort of existential question of things, it's this larger question, this larger, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean? What is my role in society and the world at large? That sort of thing.
Excellent.
All right. So, moving forward, going to talk a little bit about American spirituality. So, I mentioned that Chris was a secular patient, and so he is a part of these people increasingly self-identifying right now as atheist or non-believer. And I find this language to be problematic, but we'll address that later. But right now, let's talk about what the overall spiritual landscape looks at this moment as far as we can tell. So the best estimates of those who identify as unaffiliated or having no religious identification has increased significantly over the last decade or so. But there's a challenge to those numbers because Pew counts people who identify as atheist or agnostic in that group. So if you still hold on to traditional Baptist beliefs, but no longer affiliate yourself with the Baptist Church, you are in the same group as people who identify as atheist or agnostic. So it's a broad span of things going on there. Nevertheless, by Pew's numbers, overall the nuns make up about 25% or so of the population, and atheists make up about a total of about 9% of the population. Let's kind of look at this timeline here. So in 2007, according to the poll numbers, 78% of Americans identified as Christians. 16% were put into this group of the none of the above, unaffiliated group. At that time, 2% identified, if we kind of dig down to the numbers of who actually identified as atheist or agnostic, it's 2% identified as agnostic and 2% identified as atheist. 2 years later, in 2009, it came to be about 77% Christian, so a little bit of a dip, and 17% were part of this unaffiliated group, 3% overall identifying as agnostic, and still 2% kind of in that atheist realm of things. Jump ahead to 2014, the poll puts it at 71% Christian and 23% non, and suddenly, now we have the atheist numbers ticking up to 3%, agnostics at 4%, and in the short span of another 5 years, we've already increased another percentage point on both sides. While again, 26% are in this unaffiliated realm of things, 5% are atheists, or 5% are agnostic, 4% are atheists. And there's even some modelings that show, there's a self-underreporting of whether or not one is atheist or agnostic, again, based upon the social pressures that we talked about in the last section, and based on some modeling that it actually comes to about, an estimate of about 25% of people who are truly atheist or agnostic, which is a significant amount. About 1 in 4 people then, whether they admit it or not to somebody else, are, do not believe in God, or at least unsure of God's existence, or believe that you cannot prove God exists or does not exist, and that sort of thing. So I want to connect this then to the previous section on the overall health. I'd mentioned the research that the more certain you are, whether it is more towards the theistic existence of God or the atheistic God does not exist, there is no supernatural existence, you have better health outcomes. So those people at the greatest risk, again, for negative health outcomes are actually those religious nuns who are outside of the 5 and 4%. And those closeted atheists and agnostics, that extra, by that one modeling, additional 20% or so, or actually, 15%, 14%. And the nominally religious. So, and again, those nominally religious people and the nuns, when in crisis, return to the religion they were most recently involved in. And guess what? We are in the middle of a crisis. That's why we are doing this as we are via Zoom. And let me tell you, anecdotally, at least, we are now a month or so into this 2020 COVID pandemic, and it's currently happening. You know, as a chaplain, I spend a lot of time and I work with religious leaders and people who are ordained in their faith traditions, mostly Christians, but also rabbis and even an imam or two. Every single one of them, reports amazing attendance during their ad hoc online services, and I'm not exaggerating for effect. I mean, every single one of them. And it's not just an extra 10 or 20%. We're talking like at least a doubling of attendance. One friend talked about a weekly Bible study jumping from 10 or so regular attenders to over 30 regular attenders over the last few weeks. And I know that most of these people will probably stop attending when everything gets back to quote unquote normal, whatever that may look like after this. But in my mind, as I look at these numbers, the surge is an indication of a huge weakness of secular life as it stands right now. That most people find it hard to create meaning in their lives without community and without a foundation to build it on or a structure to nail it to. So, in other words, most people don't have the spiritual skills or resources necessary to find or hold on to deep, complex, dynamic meaning when the meaninglessness of life stares them in the face. And again, this is backed up by research. About 40% of the unaffiliated report feeling peace and well being less than once a year. That's emotional, psychological well being, not spiritual well being. And according to research, this lack of peace, again, connects to negative health outcomes, higher rates of diabetes, heart attacks, strokes, congestive heart failure, depression, anxiety. So I want to make it clear that I am not making an argument that people need to get more involved in their churches, synagogues, and mosques. I am not making that argument at all. I am making the argument that we as humanists need to step up, and we need to be willing to create and embrace a strong humanism, a non-theistic spirituality that concerns itself above all with helping humanity live a meaningful life in a meaningless world. In other words, again, helping people to be spiritually secular. So that was not nearly as long, but let's stop there and see if there's any questions.
All right, so we've got one from Bob. My Quaker meeting has had a surge in attendance at our online meetings, but most of these people are already related to our community but live miles away and are suddenly able to attend online. It's more of a statement than a question. Yeah. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think that's an important thing to keep in mind in the increase in numbers is that these are not, not everybody who is, increasing in numbers is there because of the crises. Yeah, many of them might be like, oh, I can actually, attend online because I can't get out of my house. I haven't been able to actually get to services, and now these online services are making it more readily available for me to do that. That is certainly a part, I would argue, yeah, that Bob is right, of an increase in some of these attendance. But I don't think that can account for like this tripling of numbers. And even, the people, the religious leaders that I'm talking to recognize that dynamic, that yes, some of this are people that are finally able to connect online, and that's great. But as they're talking to some of these people, getting emails and messages and chats from them, a lot of these people, a lot of the new people that are attending, the increase in these numbers are coming out of the sense of anxiety of not knowing what the hell is going on in the world right now. And they're looking for some guidance and support. And, true to the research that, that I talked about, they are going to those traditions that they, that their parents gave them when they were growing up, that they found meaningful, and in my mind, again, this is purely anecdotal. In my mind, that would account for much more of that tripling of attendance than just, oh, now something's online and I can attend.
All right. So we've got one from Jeff. What about chicken versus egg question? Could it be that people who are more depressed, etc., tend not to involve themselves in communities as opposed to the cause effect solely going the other way?
Yeah, that's a good point too, Jeff. I mean, it is in my mind a dynamic relationship. That being said, I do think that, and I'll get to this a little bit later on, that by and large, we have not presented humanism or atheism or whatever language you want to use as a positive way of life. And so people who leave faith or who question their faith tend to get into larger feelings of depression and anxiety, which can lead to more self-isolating, which can again lead into more depression and anxiety. I am not convinced entirely that humanism has done enough to say, yes, leaving your faith is painful and hard, and you have lots of valid questions, and here's a place you can go. I think that recovering from religion does a great job of that, and that's probably why it is one of our most attended meetings. I would suggest that another step that this community could do would be having something for people who are moving maybe out of recovery from religion, are looking for something that is more, okay, so how do I live my life now? Give them a more solid process for that. That might be a Humanism 101 course. That might be a building my own theology or spirituality course. I'll talk a little bit about that later. But that's kind of my response to what you got there, Jeff.
And then we've got two that I think sort of are the in a similar vein here. So Dave asked, can you explain what you mean by spirituality? I'm having trouble understanding this in a non-religious context. And then the Indian atheist also asks, what do you mean by spiritual secularism?
Perfect. I mean, that's a great segue into the next section. Where I will talk about what, let me get to the right spot, what I mean by these terms, and try to pull it all together. Before I do that, is there another outside question?
All right, let's see. This is from Jace. They ask, how do you suggest that humanists be more spiritually secular to provide the benefits to individuals that religious communities / beliefs do, and what exactly does that entail?
Again, great question, and that's where we're headed.
All right, cool.
All right. And I want to be completely honest and transparent here, and I get it that, again, according to the studies, most of us who are now humanist, atheist, agnostic, skeptic, wherever you are in this secular spectrum, we've come to this philosophy of life out of religion. Many of us, like me, grew up in spiritually, emotionally, maybe even physically abusive communities who justified all of that abuse with religion. Chris's upbringing was similar to that. That's why he didn't want to talk to a chaplain, and I get it. I'm not asking you to take on for yourself language that still carries with it a weight, a tinge, a scar of that abuse. I did not do that with Chris. I won't do that with you. Instead, the language I used with Chris is exploring the values he tried to live into. What were his sources of meaning, and how those two interacted to influence his choices he was making in the moment and over the previous 4 years before meeting me. And so this is what I mean by spirituality, to your question of what am I talking about when I'm talking about spirituality. This is different understanding than most other definitions. That's fine. There is no supernatural component. And this is the definition of spirituality that I give to my chaplain interns and residents as I am working with their educational process, as they learn how to do spiritual assessments. Spirituality, and this spiritually secular realm of things, is the form and function that people use to make meaning of their lives. So, in Chris's case, the form that he used to make meaning of his life were the relationships with his friends and the people he would be leaving behind. He valued dying a good death, which to him, and considering the legacy he left behind. So what memories did he leave behind? What unintentional expenses would his friends have to bear? What stories would they be telling about him after his death? For him, legacy is another way of maybe talking about the afterlife. What would be happening to him after his life? What were the stories? What were the memories? What were the things that he left behind? He functioned into the relationships with his friends kind of as the jokester, joke teller. He would be the one who would lighten the mood. He kind of, especially in the last 4 years or so, he went into that role as a way of helping people handle their own anxiety. And seeing him, knowing about his illness, it was hard to ignore. And so by joking about it, he was able to kind of take control of the way people initially responded to him and created a relationship with them. He also functioned by trying not to be a burden. Even in his illness, Chris was intentional about how much he asked of people. For example, if he needed help getting around town, he wouldn't ask the same person more than twice in a month. When this came to his dying process, he didn't want to be a burden to his friends either. So this meant he didn't want to leave bills behind that they would be stuck paying for, and especially for his burial and funeral services. He had done some research when he was first diagnosed, talked to a couple funeral homes in town, and found that it would be several $1,000s for him to be cremated, even without a memorial service. Again, this isn't actually entirely true. There are ways to mitigate those costs, even make them zero. But again, dealing with other moral ethical issues outside of this, he was not aware of that. And so he did not have, Chris was destitute. He didn't have several $1,000s to help pay for this. He owned a junker car, again, lived month to month on Social Security and disability. Whatever money he had left, his hospital bills would soak up. And so there would be, his friends in his mind would be left picking up the tab for this several $1,000s to get him cremated. And again, his friends were living paycheck to paycheck. They couldn't afford to pay for the cremation. And so based almost entirely on this information, this is why Chris decided to take the treatment and extend his life as long as he could, trying to delay the inevitable. So Chris created meaning from the last 4.5 years of suffering by understanding that his suffering protected the people he loved from financial ruin. It took a chaplain, I would argue, in particular a humanist chaplain, to find this out. And this was about halfway through our second hour together, where he confessed that if he had known 4 years ago what these 4 years would have looked like, he would have made a different decision. He would have taken hospice and likely be dead. I got there because of how I understood spirituality, this form and function that people use to make meaning for their lives. And over the years of practicing from this understanding of spirituality, the language I learned to listen for, listen for specific language for when working with secular patients. And so as I explored Chris's spirituality, the questions I asked led to him telling of the story of how he laid meaning over the last 4 years. And that also helped build trust with him, which allowed me to challenge Chris. And specifically, I asked him, so why are you making the same decision now? And that got him to stop and think and reprocess, to explore how different ways that he could live into these values. And this got Chris into a new place. And understand this, outside of Chris's poverty, Chris is supposed to be one of the safest people out there for positive health outcomes. While he absolutely did not believe in any form of the divine or supernatural, he was a cis white male. And because he chose to live longer than he really needed to by many of the measures of good outcomes, he was a quote unquote good outcome. But for Chris, that decision was one of the biggest regrets of his life, and yet he still felt stuck and unable to do anything else. He was sure about what he believed, but in the end, he didn't have the spiritual skills or resources necessary to find or hold on to deep, complex, dynamic meaning when all of the messiness of life, again, kind of stared him in the face. And I would argue that it took a spiritual secular professional to help Chris name his spiritual distress, not using those words, but knowing what to look for, what to listen for, so that he could start working within his spiritual construct to find a new path forward. And remember, Chris is not alone. Remember all the statistics I mentioned before. If this is what it was like for someone more certain about his belief system, what is it like for people who are more uncertain? And I can tell you, it is just as hard, if not harder for them. And so then what is our responsibility to those people as humanists to help them, to be with them, to travel with them through these struggles? And if you're here and you find yourself in that realm, that in between, you're just kind of like, hey, this is an interesting topic. I'm not necessarily humanist or secular. Stick around. I'll get to, what we can do together for everybody. So first, let me talk to the humanists and other secular people. It's understandable. It's natural. This aversion to spiritual language. And like I said before, if you find this language to continue some of the abuses and pain of your past, do not adopt it. At best, we found that language limiting, and to protect us from that abuse and pressures of living in a society that's foundational theistic, it makes sense that we rejected that language and the concepts. And when we look at the studies of how people progress from leaving one's faith, this is natural as well. We just get rid of everything that represented the old life, old language, old ways of thinking, old ways of being. And so that first step is often defining ourselves by what or who we are not. And so, we begin identifying, at least internally, as agnostic or atheist, these sorts of, I do not believe in the existence of God. Once we get through that step of things, it's harder for those of us outside of a dominant culture to claim a positive identity. And I would argue that the language of atheism and agnosticism is not a positive identity. And I'll get to that. So when I first started my training for chaplaincy, my educator gave me the assignment that he normally gives all of his students, and all of my other colleagues in that 3 months were given the same assignment. to write a paper about how I see God, the divine, whatever, the transcendent. And the nature, though, of the questions that he provided as guidelines or idea starters meant that I had to answer them in the negative. And so my initial paper, the rough draft, worked essentially to tell everyone what I wasn't. It read to me as 3 pages of here's exactly what Ben lacks, why Ben cannot be a chaplain. And try as I might, it was incredibly challenging intellectually and emotionally to present myself out of this negative language. I'm not that, I'm not that, I'm not that, into the language of, but I am this. Fortunately, my educator quickly recognized this and worked with me to start to change language so that I could define my work by what I had. So I could sidestep that first, I'm not this, I'm not this, I'm not this. And I could just start with here's what I have. And that was an empowering moment. The dominant culture naturally assumes you are with them, unless it is clear that you are not. So for people of color and a white culture, that otherness, that difference is clear, and the othering may be more blatant. Although, the need for Black Lives Matter movement also shows just how easily the dominant culture tends to ignore and erase these differences. But this is the line that those of us in the religious minority must walk. Not allowing our erasure while claiming a positive yet different identity, an authentically different identity from the majority. And as long as we remain in the world of the negative language, I would argue that we give the majority power, because in order for our quote unquote not that to exist, we must first have that. So let me clarify that sentence and all those that's. And this is why you will rarely hear me identify as an atheist. While atheism informs my humanism in my mind is more than my atheism. I'm not going to get into a debate also over the correct philosophical meaning of atheism. If you go to the philosophical dictionary, it's a very long article over the different understandings and meanings of positive versus negative atheism, all that stuff. That's a conversation honestly, for another time. But I think it is important in this to talk about more than the actual quote unquote dictionary correct meaning of atheism, but to talk about the popular understanding of atheism, or what it means to be an atheist. And that atheist is someone who doesn't believe in a God or in the supernatural, or they don't believe in God. In other words, someone who is not a theist. For the atheist to exist, there must be a theist. This means that theists are ultimately in control of the atheist's identity. This is also connected with the language of the nuns. Identifying a group as none signals that they inherently lack something. The majority of Christians assume that the nuns lack hope or meaning in their lives. They assume there is no source of morality, and this bias plays out even into atheists. When presented with scenarios where people respond differently along a scale of ethical behavior, the vast majority assume that atheists did the least ethical behavior. And this is just one example of the effect of negative identity. This assumption of lacking. The power of a positive identity is the power of declaration. There is power in affirming what you hold true rather than what you hold to be not true. And this is what we have hidden from people leaving their faiths and possibly ourselves. We've created barriers to community and support that don't need to be there, I would argue. We may have worked through what we have lost, but the vast majority of us have not worked through what we have gained. And without that step, what do we have to offer those people who are a part of the unaffiliated, who are the nuns? So it makes sense then in the time of crisis that they return to the faith of their youth. They've not been offered anything substantial, alternative. And I would argue that one reason for that, maybe the major reason for that, is because we have no easily accessible language around meaning making and establishing the philosophy of life. By rejecting the language of spirituality, we have unintentionally rejected the bridge from theism to secularism. I would argue that we as humanists can offer society spiritual secularism. That is a way of being that is filled with meaning and thus spiritual, but grounded in the reality of science, research, the physical world, and thus secular. And so this is what I argue it means to be spiritually secular. It is not a dualistic approach to life. It is actually a very holistic approach to life, where that which gives our lives energy and meaning are not hidden, are not negated, but embraced and celebrated. And this is not merely code switching either, where the minority adapts their language to be more understandable to the majority. I see this as an assertive taking over of the majority's language. So remember, the numbers are on our side. If the demographic trends continue the way they have, the potential for a spiritually secular revolution is incredibly high. Now, we can wait and be reactive, or we can start reworking the language now and creating the bridge now so that others who leave their traditions do not have to have the struggle that many of us had to find a new home. And I would argue also that the first step in this process is the reworking of the word theology. And Anthony Penn, the humanist theologian out at Rice University, wrote a book called The End of God Talk, an African-American humanist theology, where he reworks the word theology. And we can continue this work by now, how do we understand spirituality? So that it is no longer this nebulous word implying a supernatural realm. Who the hell knows what we mean when someone says they're spiritual? To the understanding that human beings need to make meaning from their world and have ways of doing that. Sometimes they work, sometimes it doesn't. But this means we need to not be afraid of the language of the past. We can talk about transcendent. What is the transcendent in humanism? If not the entire history of the universe in humanity's tiny role. From the Big Bang to the present to whatever the future of the universe entails, this transcends our 70, 80, 100 years of our lives, the hundreds of thousands of years of human existence. In a sense, evolution, it could be seen, is a sense of a type of secular mythology, not in the sense that something is false, but it is our foundational story. When we take time to dwell on the implications of evolution, it can have a huge impact on how we live our lives, how we understand suffering, and how we find meaning. For example, to use the language of the Humanist Manifesto, that we arrived here by unguided evolution, again, means that our lives are inherently meaningless. There is no inherent meaning to our lives. There's nothing guiding us to a certain point. There's nothing guiding the world, the universe to a certain point in time. We are simply living our lives here by chance. This can be depressing, or it can be invigorating. It cannot be quite freeing. Meaning making in a meaningless world means that it's fluid. The meaning is fluid and subjective, so I'm free to make meaning out of a scenario of my life, something that works for me in the moment, and others are free to make their own meaning out of it in their own way. And if meaning is fluid, when I enter into a crisis, instead of having to go, well, this form of meaning is not working for me, let me chunk it out entirely and go to whatever thing worked for me elsewhere. It means if meaning making is fluid, we can continue to mold the meaning of that scenario. And that means that we have a greater sense of resilience within our lives. So, what I would like to see, and I know some of us have talked about what this might look like, is within the next year or so having a Humanism 101 course where, you know, we help people develop language and a way of living in the world that is grounded foundationally on humanism, and not afraid to address some of these languages, but to say the way this language has been used elsewhere is not the way it has to be used now, and we can move forward in a new way. That's really what I would like to see humanism go, in a way of being guided by our compassion for people who are having all of these negative health outcomes. What can we do? What do we have to offer them that is positive, that is not putting an unnecessary hurdle in front of them in order to create the meaning that they need or will find helpful in that moment? And I think the openness of humanism, the flexibility of humanism, the positive statement of humanism into the world offers quite a bit. And with that, I will end Chris's story. So again, Chris's meaning making, his questions were around his legacy, his afterlife, the mythology of Chris. What would the stories be that would live long after Chris's death? He didn't want it to be, Chris was a nice guy, but damn, he left us with a lot of money that we had to chuck out for him. Didn't want to be, Chris was this sad, lonely person. It wanted to be, Chris was this vibrant person who embraced life even in the midst of his suffering, took care of his friends, ensured that he died a good death. And that's what we were able to help him do. When he made that confession to me, or the reason about why he, you know, kept making the same decision over and over and over again, and that he had come to regret, it was an easy fix. You know, so we printed off some documents from the internet, got him in touch with the funeral home in town that specializes in this service, that has the local municipality, the state, take over the costs. It is not several $1,000s, it is $750, and the funeral home does it cheaply for that amount, and it doesn't cost Chris's family or friends anything. He was able to sit down and write with them about what his funeral was going to look like, which ultimately ended up in like a funeral service while he was alive, a memorial service while he was alive. He was being memorialized and could hear the legacy that he was leaving behind with his friends. And this was incredibly comforting and powerful to Chris, to his friends, and to those who were caring for him. And so that when he died, then a week or so later, everybody, Chris, those surrounding him knew that uh, he was living into his values. He was living into the way he wanted his life to be lived, and it was being honored and celebrated. And to me, that is a spiritually secular space to be as a humanist, as a secular person caring for another secular patient. We created a different kind of awe filled, what some might call sacred space. And I will end it there. Any questions?
All right, Ben, we did have one that came up. Said, out of curiosity, since spirituality refers to religious process of reformation, about Ben's profession as a chaplain, instead of using the term spirituality, if you use the psychological terms as consciousness or mindfulness, do you think that would your patients would take offense or might not be able to understand those terms?
Yeah, that's a good question. I, in my experience, it is the latter. As far as it's not so much that they take offense; it's that they just don't understand uh, the terminology. It's not language that they've become accustomed to. Um, I've tried at some points through my journey to, use language other than this spirituality language. And mindfulness is a little more accessible than consciousness. Um, but more often than not, you get blank stares and they say, "What do you mean by that?" And then I switch to the spiritual language and unpack it a little bit from the spiritual language side, remaining spiritually secular, and it clicks for them, which is a part of my I don't know if resistance is too strong of a word, but is my hesitance on trying to create new language. Why not take what we have and take it over and make it useful and meaningful for us now?
All right, so the great Ricardo asks or says, I personally prefer to refer to myself as a naturalist instead of atheist.
Sure.
Atheist implies a negation of theism, stating what I am not. Naturalism posits a positive statement of what I believe exists, all that is natural. In this case, the other 75% are supernaturalists. Do you feel that attempts to reframe the language of what we are to the positive by using such terms as naturalist or humanist instead of atheist / agnostic can have a positive impact on others' understanding of us?
Absolutely. And that's a key part of why I don't typically use the term atheist agnostic. Um, it's, if you listen carefully, you'll hear me talk a lot about secular patients, secular people, humanists, um, in a way of uh, helping to create a more positive experience, a positive emotional response um, to those of us who are naturalist or secular or humanist. Um, and when I'm talking to chaplains, I actually go through, what is what are your feelings when you hear somebody say, "Thanks, chaplain, but I'm an atheist," versus what are your feelings towards someone who says, "Thanks, chaplain, I'm don't need to talk to you, I'm a humanist." And we process their emotional responses, and then at the end of that 5 or 10 minutes or so, I go through, well, all of these languages, including atheist, uh, can be referred to me. And depending on how I presented myself to them, they have different emotional responses, and the burden is on the chaplain at that point to recognize their emotional response and stay with the patient as respectfully as they can to give the patient more opportunity to reflect on their meaning making. What I would use the language of spirituality. That's an amazing process to go through with students and professional chaplains, where they have not yet realized the emotional bias that comes into language, the language that people use to identify themselves, the language that they use to label other people. And so I agree, using these positive declarations, in your case, naturalism goes a long way in helping people feel more positive towards us. And I would also argue that that puts then a less of a hurdle in people who are leaving some form of theism into humanism, into naturalism. Um, they they no longer have to, or the feelings of anxiety or around defining oneself as an atheist can be much less, because again, while atheism is a part of humanism, it is only a part. It is not. I can define humanism informs my, or atheism informs my humanism, but my humanism is much more than
All right, so we've got one from Jeff again. I think a lot of people who leave religion or never were religious wind up in some other positive identity unrelated to God, no God. Environmentalist, Marxist, objectivist, anarchist, punk rocker, animal rights, or whatever.
that.
Should we be trying to sell humanist identities to some of these individuals?
That is a good question that honestly I don't have a problem with. Um, but as I work, I see those as great places of spirituality, and I don't see a real need to challenge that. I think, again, uh, those are places where someone can be um, Marxist and humanist, or I forget the various lists that atheists or that Jeff gave us. Um, I think that yes, we can sell humanism, or we can offer humanism to those people um, in a very, I think, probably easy way. My concern here is more about those who find themselves um, uh, unaffiliated. Community for them has just, in some sense, disappeared. While someone might find meaning in environmentalism, that's great. I would argue with my chaplains that that is their spirituality, and let's work on that. Um, that the offering of humanism has more greater good impact on those who are in the unaffiliated realm of things, who are looking for some way to understand the world.